So Cosmic Skeptic is a popular YouTube atheist who came out with a new video called How the Bible Supports Slavery. Now, personally, I tend to like the kid, which is why I regret having to make this video. So towards the beginning of the video, he makes the argument that God is the OG slave owner, right?
Would it be cheap of me to point out that Christians believe themselves to be in absolute subjection to the divine, and so yes, God literally did invent slavery, himself being the first and eternal slaver of mankind.
And not just that, God is far worse than any human slave owner in history, and his slavery is the kind of slavery that's far worse than the kind of slavery that was used during the slave trade. And yes, he's serious. So to try to show that God's not only a cosmic slave owner, but also one that's far worse than any slave master in history could ever dream of, he tries to illustrate this with the following analogy.
Now imagine the slaver in the slave trade again. His slave is on his knees in front of the slaver, and the slaver offers him an ultimatum. This is your last chance, he says. I'm going to give you a choice. You continue to work the fields for me without pay, or I'll lock you and your family up and whip you 100 times. But it's your choice. Follow me or reject me, and don't forget to be grateful that I'm being so merciful as to offer you the choice. Clearly, this is a grotesque form of slavery, and there is no choice. And in fact, imprisonment and 100 lashes is nowhere near as bad as the torments of hell. All this is to say, God is no stranger to the concept of human slavery.
So when we think of slavery, what do we usually think about? We usually think about kidnapping someone against their will because of their race, taking them to another country, forcing them to work 15 hours a day in the scorching heat, and then beating them into submission when they don't comply so that way they can comply in the future. Now, does that sound anything like what God does to us? If it does, can I just ask, what's it like being in the 4th grade for the 11th year in a row? It seems like he's given an ultimatum that says, if you say, do this or bad things will happen, that's slavery. But that is not slavery. That could either be a fact, a recommendation, or a threat. If I say that if you eat donuts for every single meal for the next 5 years of your life, you will be very unhealthy and will probably die. Now, that's not slavery, that's a fact. If I say if you don't stop dressing up like Spider-Man to every job interview, you're probably not going to get the job, that's probably a little bit more of a recommendation. Or if I say get out of my face or I will beat you to death, then that is probably a threat. Now, of course, none of those are equivalent to slavery, so what Alex is talking about in this argument is not slavery. But because I have a little bit of time still, we can go ahead and talk about Alex's non-slavery understanding of God and instead call it a threat. Alex also believes that we need to look beyond the euphemistic language of religion in order to understand what's really being said.
We have to be incredibly careful to unpack the euphemistic language of religion to understand what the real message is behind any teaching.
And this message that he believes that he uncovered is God saying basically, follow me or you will burn in hell for all of eternity.
So what kind of choice is it exactly that God offers if the consequences of this choice are as severe as the Bible reports? Remember, the choice isn't just follow me or reject me as you please. It's follow me or reject me and be sent to suffer in an unimaginable series of torture for eternity.
But where in the Bible does it say that? Now, I can't think of anywhere in the Bible where it says that. The only times where I can think of where the words follow me is used is when Jesus is assembling the disciples and he's telling them to literally follow him as he goes on his missions. It has nothing to do with eternal fire if they don't want to follow him. And this is obvious if you just consider how Jesus talked to everybody else who wasn't going to go along with him on his journey. But let's not forget that our friend Alex here is reading behind the euphemistic language in order to uncover the true deep meanings. Meaning so deep that not even the Christians knew that they were there. So what Alex must mean here is not that God is the OG of slavery, but instead God is the OG of threatening. So the question is still on the table. Does God threaten us with hell if we don't choose to work for him? Not exactly. In fact, the entire point of the Bible is actually the literal opposite. God says that we can't work our way up to him. We can't do work in order to gain salvation. The gospel says that God is not giving us salvation based on any work that we do. We can't earn it. If we could earn it, then we could boast. But we can't earn it, so therefore we can't boast and we can't feel superior to anyone else. That's the message of the gospel. So to be clear, the message behind the Bible can't be God saying, do this amount of work or I will send you to hell. If so, then his comparison to slavery might be a little bit better because he's saying, do this or I will torture you. It wouldn't necessarily be slavery, but it would still be a better comparison. Instead, the Bible says, accept my free payment for the things that you yourself did wrong. I'll pay them myself for you, just let me. Now that's not slavery, that's freedom. Not only the freedom to choose, but also the freedom to be set free from the wrongs that you yourself did. So the next time you see the Cosmic Skeptic saying,
God is no stranger to the concept of human slavery.
what are you gonna say? What do you meme? Cosmic Skeptic recently put out a new video called How the Bible Supports Slavery. And in the video, not only does he argue that the Bible does support slavery, but it's that bad kind of slavery, like the slavery that we saw during the American slave trade. So I recently did a video talking about the first argument that he made in this video, knowing that I would probably end up having to do a follow-up video if enough people demanded it. A lot of Cosmic Skeptic's fans echoed the same thing that this commenter did when he wrote, "Pretty weak argument. Most of what the Cosmic Skeptic had to say was not even addressed, and I think we all know why." And so I responded, yeah, we all know why, because I said so in the pinned post, LOL. In the pinned post, I said how I only addressed the first argument and would be making a part 2 or maybe a part 3 if enough people requested it. He writes back, why didn't you address what the Bible says about the non-Hebrew slaves and how they are being treated? Hint, you won't like it. So I responded, LOL. Do you really think that I've never heard any of this before? I'll respond to it in follow-up vids. Hint, you won't like it. So by popular demand, I'll be responding to the remainder of the points in Cosmic Skeptic's video. Now I usually don't do this type of video because I don't typically like when people critique videos by responding to every single thing the person said, because then their bad points get all mixed into the wash. But in this case, because enough people said it, I think I'll go ahead and proceed forth with it. So with that being said, relax and hang tight, because this is gonna be a good one. So in case you haven't seen his original video, which is in the description, in his video, he's responding to another video. So this video is a response to his video responding to another video. And it sounds a little awkward worded that way, but anyways, you guys ready to get into it? Word. Then let's go!
Okay, so on to the video.
Hey everyone, my name is Allen Parr. Thank you all so much for visiting my channel. Here on The Beat, we release a new video every single Tuesday, and today we are answering the controversial and many times misunderstood question, does the Bible support slavery? And so what I want to do is I want to give you 7 facts and show you how slavery in the Bible was very different than the slavery that was practiced in our country.
So this should be our first cause for concern. The video begins by suggesting that we're about to hear an argument that the Bible doesn't support slavery, and yet we're now being readied for, instead of, here is proof, unequivocal proof that the Bible condemns slavery, rather something more like, well, slavery is supported in the Bible, but it's a special kind of slavery that isn't all that bad. Obviously, this hasn't been explicitly said yet, but I want you to pay attention to the language being used here. Consider this question throughout the video. Are we being offered proof that the Bible does not justify slavery? Or are we being offered an excuse for the fact that it does?
All right, so to start, giving context and clarifying terms is not the same thing as making excuses. We'll see what happens throughout the video, but just note that either Cosmic Skeptic is right and Parr is just making excuses. In that case, then Parr is guilty of acting as if there's a relevant distinction between biblical slavery and non-biblical slavery when there really isn't. Or Parr is given relevant distinctions that are significant and also given context, in which case Cosmic Skeptic would actually be guilty of acting as if there are no relevant distinctions when in actuality there are. So who is the guilty offender here? We'll see.
Number 1, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it.
Okay, would it be cheap of me to point out that Christians believe themselves to be in absolute subjection to the divine, and so yes, God literally did invent slavery, himself being the first and eternal slaver of mankind? Perhaps, but it's an important point. God did in fact invent the concept of the ownership of human beings, since he himself has an absolute right and authority over our lives.
Okay, stop right there. Now right off the bat, we have a pretty bad argument. So first off, willful submission is not the same thing as slavery. This seems pretty obvious. I willfully submit to my wife and I willfully entered into marriage with her, but that doesn't mean that I'm a slave. Now I've already responded to this argument in the previous video, but let me just add another quick thought here. So let's be clear on his argument here. He states that God is a slave owner because he has a right and authority over mankind. But if you have children like I do, you also have a right and authority over them. But that doesn't mean that you're a slave owner just because you created them. I mean, but okay, I'll play ball. So let's just go ahead and grant that. If you have a right and authority over people, then that makes you a slave owner. But just as my kids can grow up and move out and they can choose to separate from my love, my guidance, and my protection, we can also choose to separate ourselves from God's love, guidance, and protection. That's actually what hell is according to the Bible. And it doesn't even matter what view you hold on hell. All of the views that I know all agree that hell is separation from God. So even on his argument, a person can still choose to separate from God if they wish.
This is, of course, not the kind of slavery being discussed in the video, but if anything, this even more undeniable type of slavery propagated in the Bible is even worse than the kind apparent in the slave trade. At least when owned by a human being, there's always a chance of redemption, changes in the law, escaping to freedom, or at the very least death, if it's decided that no life is better than one spent in bondage. This is all possible in something like the slave trade. Not so much with the ownership of human beings by God. There is no escape, there is no chance of a change in the law, there is no appeal, and there is no death. Now, I can already hear you. Alex, don't be such a melodramatic Hitchens impersonator. God isn't a slave owner. Slave owners don't offer their slaves a chance to access paradise, and they certainly don't give them a choice. They chain them up and whip them into forced labor. God gives his subjects a choice. They're able to follow him or not, as they please. We have to be incredibly careful to unpack the euphemistic language of religion, to understand what the real message is behind any teaching. So, what kind of choice is it exactly that God offers if the consequences of this choice are as severe as the Bible reports? Remember, the choice isn't just follow me or reject me as you please. It's follow me or reject me and be sent to suffer in an unimaginable series of torture for eternity.
Okay, so now we've moved on from Christians being slaves because they willfully choose to submit to God, but now we're talking about all of humanity being slaves because they don't have a choice. So to be clear, his argument seems to be that being forced to choose between God and hell is really no choice at all. So this doesn't just make Christians slaves, but it makes all of humanity slaves. Now what's wrong with this argument? To be clear, just because God doesn't offer as an alternative choice that Cosmic Skeptic would prefer, doesn't mean that we don't have any choices at all. That doesn't mean that God hasn't given us a choice, it means that God's only given us a choice between two alternatives. I mean, let's consider the logic being used here. So we all have to follow the speed limit. Now, if we choose to speed anyway and we get caught, then we have to suffer the consequences for the choice that we made. So we have two options here. We can either do what the lawmakers say and obey the law, or we can choose not to and then suffer the consequences for that choice. Does that mean because I don't like either of these two choices that the speed limit laws are slavery? Is Jesse Smollett innocent? Nope. So if the speed limit laws don't make us slaves, then only having two choices that we don't like do not make us slaves either.
Now imagine the slaver in the slave trade again. His slave is on his knees in front of the slaver, and the slaver offers him an ultimatum. This is your last chance, he says. I'm going to give you a choice. You continue to work the fields for me without pay, or I'll lock you and your family up and whip you 100 times. But it's your choice. Follow me or reject me, and don't forget to be grateful that I'm being so merciful as to offer you the choice. Clearly, this is a grotesque form of slavery, and there is no choice. And in fact, imprisonment and 100 lashes is nowhere near as bad as the torments of hell. All this is to say, God is no stranger to the concept of human slavery.
But to make matters even worse, if there could be such a thing, Cosmic Skeptic does not seem to understand the basic understanding of the gospel in Christianity, and it's not as grim as he tries to make it out to be. In Christianity, here's the real choice. God is giving you two options, one of which is God himself paying for all of the things that you yourself have done wrong, or you can choose to pay the consequences for all the things that you yourself have done wrong yourself. So God's actually offering to pay your debt. So if we relate this back to the slave owner analogy, what do we get? On one hand, we have a slave that's much more like a prisoner in today's society. We have somebody that did a lot of things wrong and he has to pay the consequences for those things that he did wrong. And on the other hand, we have the slave owner who says, hey, let me pay for the things that you did wrong so that way you don't have to pay for them yourself and I'll take on the suffering so that way you don't have to suffer. That's the analogy that's more accurate when we're talking about Christianity.
Number one, God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it.
So here's the spot where we have to stop and define some terms real quick so that way we can understand what's meant by the word slave for the remainder of the video. What is the slave? According to our modern dictionary, a slave is a person who's the legal property of another person and is forced to obey them. Now it's pretty obvious what we think of when we hear the word slave today. We all have a mental picture of what we learned growing up in school. As a black man who has ancestors that were kidnapped and brought to America, forced into abusive labor, I can emotionally relate to the connotation that this word has for us today. This is obviously something that I don't take lightweight. So when we think of the word slave, we're usually thinking of people being held against their will and treated as things instead of people. By things, I mean objects that don't have the rights of people, and the owner can do whatever they wish to their things. So in other words, what makes the word slavery so offensive today is that it carries the emotional connotation of people being degraded and oppressed and treated like things instead of people. In our culture, when we hear the word slave, we immediately think of the American slave trade. In the Old Testament, the Hebrew word that's being translated to slave is abed, which comes from the root word abad, which means to work or to serve. So the word abed directly translates to the words worker or servant. There is no Hebrew word for slave. The word abed was a neutral word that denotes a relationship based on dependency. So the word was neutral, it wasn't inherently negative, which is why we see the word used in positive ways and also used as a word of honor. But as anybody who's actually really looked deep into this subject realizes that things just aren't as cut and dry as we would like for them to be. In the Old Testament times, we could say that there were about 3 main categories that slaves or servants would fall under. The first, and by far the most common, are servants who are voluntarily working to pay off debt or to acquire land. These are the Hebrew servants or slaves. The next categories are foreigners who are non-Hebrew, but who also voluntarily entered into work for the same reasons. They wanted to pay off debt or acquire land as well, and we'll get into more of the context about this later on. And then there's the third category of servants or slaves. This is the category where we can just call them the bad guys for now. In this category is where you're going to find those like the prisoner of wars who were captured from other armies. Obviously, things were going to be a little bit different for these people because they were more of a threat. They'd be working harder and they'd be under a tighter watch, but these guys weren't slaves, they were prisoners. The Hebrew words and the context help us to discern what category of these servants or slaves we're talking about, and also how God instructed for them to be treated during biblical times. The slaves that are mentioned in the main verses that Cosmic Skeptic talking about are best understood as workers or servants. They weren't the bad guys. Although he does talk about the bad guys later on towards the end of his video. But overall, the people that he's talking about were working to pay off debt, to acquire land, or looking for a new place to live. So it wasn't like the slave trade in America. Now, I'm not trying to romanticize this type of slavery. I'm not trying to say that it was always easy or anything like that. But one thing that needs to be clear is that it was voluntary. Now, I know that Cosmic Skeptic objects to this, so we're going to go ahead and visit his objections here in a little bit in the video.
God did not create slavery, but rather he regulated it. And so just like there were laws about murder and theft and polygamy and divorce, God knew that the hearts of people were evil, and so he had to establish laws that would regulate slavery.
Okay, stop. Yes, the Bible contains laws regulating murder, theft, polygamy, and divorce. But here's an important question. What are these regulations exactly? Well, let's see. The regulations on murder are don't do it. The regulations on theft are don't do it. Polygamy, divorce, yeah, don't do it. The laws regulating these things were not regulations, but explicit condemnations. Exodus 20:15, for instance, reads, "Thou shalt not steal." This leaves no room for confusion, and I wouldn't dream of arguing that the Bible endorses theft. The only, I'll repeat, the only appropriate regulation on slavery is its abolition. Anything less than this at the very least demonstrates that God doesn't feel as strongly about it as he does, say, divorce or adultery. "Thou shalt not claim ownership of other human beings" is nowhere to be found in the pronouncements at Sinai or in any of the books that follow it. Why not?
Okay, so Parr here, the other guy that was in the video, was a little sloppy and seemingly implying that all of the things that are regulated are in the same category. But Cosmic Skeptic's basic question still holds. The basic question here seems to be, why did God flat out command things like don't kill, don't steal? But when it comes to slavery, instead of flat out commanding against slavery, he punched regulations around it. Well, the first thing that came to my mind when I considered Cosmic Skeptic's question was that he's still holding on to this faulty assumption as if it wasn't consensual and there was no benefit for both parties involved. It seems that if he did, then that would explain why it was different than murder and theft. The only person that feels like they got some sort of benefit from murder and theft is the person that's doing the killing or the stealing. What Cosmic Skeptic still seems to have in mind is involuntary forced labor. And as we'll see in a little bit, it was voluntary and there were mutual benefits for both parties. And that's why it makes a lot more sense to regulate it instead of flat out abolishing it.
He had to establish laws that would regulate slavery and ensure the proper treatment of slaves.
Ensure the proper treatment of slaves. Again, I'll press this. The only proper treatment of slaves is their emancipation, and nothing that falls short of this. There were no laws making sure that the victims of theft were properly treated. People were simply told not to do it. Proper treatment of slaves is a contradiction in terms.
Okay, just as we discussed before, the only reason that he sees a contradiction between slavery and the proper treatment of slaves is because he's still presupposing a view of slavery that was like the slavery that we found during the American slave trade. But he hasn't demonstrated this assumption yet, he's only assumed it. But as we'll see later, he actually concedes that there is some truth to the fact that some slavery was voluntary, but we'll get to that later. But if I can, may I throw in a little bit of a side note here? Cosmic Skeptic is a moral subjectivist. He made a video a while back about how morality is just an opinion, and he also had a debate on this with my friend Michael from Inspiring Philosophy. In the debate, Cosmic Skeptic argues that there isn't anything that's objectively right and wrong. By the way, objective here means morality that's true for everyone and morality that everyone is bounded to. So when he seems to insist that there's only one proper treatment of slaves and that everybody ought to follow it, even God apparently, then he's instantly discredited his own views inside of his own worldview. And this is no minor slip up either. This is a huge problem when he claims that there's only one proper way to treat slaves inside of his worldview, where all views and all ways to treat slaves are inherently equal.
And so the very fact that there is a law about it at all indicates that God did not approve of it, and it wasn't his perfect will, because God did not establish laws to regulate or limit good, only to regulate evil.
This is quite embarrassingly ridiculous. We know God didn't approve of slavery because he made laws regulating it. Think about that for a minute. During the time of slavery in the USA, there were many laws regulating the slave trade regarding movement, punishment, education, and other treatment of slaves. Does this in any way justify the practice or indicate that the US at the time was actually anti-slavery just because they had regulations? Of course not. Also, let's not pretend like God doesn't regulate all sorts of things that he approves of as well, like worship and marriage and sex and other things which show that God regulating a certain practice doesn't indicate that he opposes it, just that he wants it to be performed in a certain way. Again, what is indicative of him opposing something is an explicit condemnation of it, which he doesn't provide for slavery, only regulations. And again, the only appropriate regulation for slavery is its abolition.
Okay, here I actually agree with the general point that Cosmic Skeptic is making. If Parr wanted to justify his point, then he would have needed to establish more steps to get to his conclusion. I'm not saying that Parr is wrong here per se, but in order for Parr to make his case, he needs to have more points showing when regulating means disapproval.
Further, notice the flip-flopping here. Earlier, like we discussed, this guy was saying that slavery in the Bible isn't what it was in the USA. It isn't like the slave trade. The word meant a different thing back then. And this indicated that the Bible does condone slavery, but that that's okay because slavery didn't mean what it does today. But now we're hearing from this guy how the Bible apparently doesn't condone slavery, implying that biblical slavery was the bad kind of slavery as we do know it today. In other words, we're first being hit by slavery is condoned, but it meant something different back then. But when this fails, when someone points out that actually this was the evil kind of slavery, the narrative is completely switched up, and it's instead argued that slavery isn't condoned. This is indicative of that characteristically religious style of arguing that's more concerned with defending its conclusion and saving face than it is with actually analysing the ideas in question. The apologist will quickly change up their argument and subtly contradict their previous thoughts if it means that they can avoid admitting that they might be mistaken, or worse, God forbid, that the Bible might be mistaken.
Okay, stop. My goodness, stop. So here Cosmic Skeptic criticizes Parr for initially arguing that the slavery in the Bible is not the same slavery that was in the West, and then Parr switches his argument to say that God isn't cool with slavery either. But did you catch that? Did you see what happened? If you notice, Cosmic Skeptic starts off by recapping Parr's argument, but then he inserts something into his recap that had nothing to do with Parr's argument. Cosmic Skeptic reframed Parr's argument, and then he said,
When this fails, when someone points out that actually this was the evil kind of slavery, the narrative is completely switched up.
Now, I agree that Parr did switch up his argument, but what Cosmic Skeptic is implying of him isn't true at all of what Parr did. There is no one pointing out this kind of slavery which caused Parr to change his position. Cosmic Skeptic just inserted some fictional character into his recap, and then he went on to say, see, this is what theists do when you press them. In Parr's video, Parr did switch gears for his own reasons, but those reasons were not in reaction to some non-theist interlocutor. It's not as though Parr were responding to Cosmic Skeptic or anyone else putting pressure on him. So, Cosmic Skeptic, that was smooth, and I'm sure it worked on some, but it wasn't smooth enough, homeboy. Now, I do hope you realize that there are a lot of parts of the video, so make sure that you're in the playlist. I have that link down in the description, and so that way you can catch all of it, because all of these are going to tie together in some way, so you have to watch them all. So if you're not already in the playlist, go ahead and click right here. I'll see you guys over at the next video. And, oh yeah. What do you meme? Welcome back to my channel and the second part of a three-part series in response to Cosmic Skeptic's video called How the Bible Supports Slavery. In this video, we're going to be talking about what a lot of the critics of the Bible are convinced proves beyond any reasonable doubt that the Bible supports slavery. But in my mind, we haven't even got warmed up yet. So stick around to the end of the video because I'm convinced that today's video is only going to get better and better. Usually when I record a video, I want to hear the absolute best objections and arguments against my position, so that way I can take them into consideration before I even record my video. In this case, I watched as many videos from skeptics on this topic as I could find, and what I found is that there's really only two main verses that skeptics use in order to justify their position that the Bible supports slavery. And that's when I realized that those two passages are the very best passages that they have in support of their position. So they really need those passages. They need them like a fat kid needs cake. They need them like Jussie Smollett needed the Obamas. They need them like I need Chick-fil-A on a Sunday. They need them like some online atheists need to call everyone who disagrees with them dishonest. And the beautiful thing is that Cosmic Skeptic's argument is no exception. In the video, he argued most of his position from those two passages, and those two passages are the ones we're going to be talking about today. So, are you guys excited? I know I am. Let's go! So I think it's actually pretty easy to pinpoint where exactly me and Cosmic Skeptic disagree. And so we're clear, there's about 5 things I can think of that make slavery so morally wrong, and Cosmic Skeptic seems to think that these two passages teach these things. 1, being kidnapped and taken against your will. 2, stripped of all your rights. 3, the slaver can beat you and abuse you as much as he wishes since you're his property. In other words, he's treating you as a thing rather than a person. 4, there's no compensation or benefit for you, only the slaver benefits. And 5, you're forced to stay for life against your will. Now, Cosmic Skeptic and I both agree that this is horrendous and we both find it repulsive. Now, I thought I was clear here, but apparently some commenters pulled a Kathy Newman on me saying that I was actually saying that I was in support of slavery. Me? When the Bible talks about slavery, it doesn't always mean what you think it does. Brainless commenters. So you're saying you're a black man who supports slavery. You're a disgusting human being. No, that's not what I said. Again, Cosmic Skeptic and I are on the same page here. We both find it repulsive. Our disagreement comes over the passages that he mentions and if it actually teaches those things or not. Now, I said it before and I'll say it again, I tend to like the kid and he doesn't strike me as an intentionally dishonest person, so it's nothing personal. It's just his arguments that I have a problem with. So let's just go through the passages as they come up in his video and we'll check back at the end of the video to see where we land. So let's pick up right from where we left off last time.
So what kind of slavery are we really dealing with in the Bible? We haven't actually seen any references yet, so let's take a minute to explore what slavery did mean in the Bible and to consider the religious defense that the slavery condoned in the Bible is not slavery as we'd recognize it today. This is a defense that the guy in this video speaks about next, so let's listen.
Number 2, the purpose of slavery in the Bible, as we're getting ready to see, was actually designed to help the poor survive, which was the exact opposite of what was practiced in our country for nearly 400 years.
This is true.
This leads me to my third point, which is that in the Hebrew culture, slavery was primarily volitional. So in other words, if a person was too poor to provide for themselves, or if they were in debt, they would oftentimes hire themselves out to someone who was richer who could provide for them or pay off all of their debt.
This is also true. Slavery was primarily volitional. Okay, now I want you to think about something. What is the first thing you think of when you hear the word gay? And I know this is a really weird question, but just bear with me. Now, with that in mind, remember that we used to understand the word to mean happy. Back in the day, if you picked up a book on being gay, you'd be expecting something completely different than you would be if you picked up a book on being gay today. So would it be dishonest of you for you to tell somebody that the word gay means something different now than it used to mean? I don't think so. Not to mention, a lot of people use the word gay today to talk about things instead of people. The point is here, words are just signposts. In order to understand what's meant by the word, we first need to understand the context that the word is being used in. And this is true of all human language. And my position is something similar is going on when we read about slavery in the Bible. And I think Cosmic Skeptic would agree with me on this point as well. And that's why he spends a lot of time talking about the context. He's talking about what is meant by the word. The good news is this can actually settle me and Cosmic Skeptic's disagreement. Either the context of these passages supports his understanding or they don't. Let's keep going.
Debt. Others would choose to be slaves to ensure that all of their basic needs were met by their master. Either way, slavery in the Hebrew culture was volitional.
True again. Parr was factually correct on all 3 points. So now back to you, Mr. Cosmic. What say you?
Okay, so there's a lot there and there's some level of truth to this, but let's actually analyze one of the most explicit references to slavery made in the Bible to see what we're really dealing with. Atheists are quick to point to chapters like Leviticus 25 to prove that the Bible condones slavery. So let's take a look at verses 44 to 46 from this chapter.
And like a moth to a flame, they just cannot resist this verse. As Tecton TV says,
when it comes to the Bible and slavery, there's one passage that fundy atheists love so much that I wonder if they sleep in pajamas decorated with it. I'm talking about Leviticus 25, 42 through 46.
But if this verse and the next verse that we're going to be talking about doesn't prove what they think it proves, then that means that the case that the Bible supports slavery is incredibly weak, because these verses are the absolute best that they could come up with. So let's get back into it.
So let's take a look at verses 44 to 46 from this chapter. Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. You may also buy some of the temporary residents living among you and members of their clans born in your country, and they will become your property. You can bequeath them to your children as inherited property and can make them slaves for life, but you must not rule over your fellow Israelites ruthlessly. That last point, by the way, about the Israelites highlights the tribalism of the Bible, since it's condoning slavery, but only when the slaves are taken from other nations.
Well, on the face of it, this verse surely does seem to support his point. As we'll see, he seems to believe that this passage proves the 4 following points. 1. That slaves could be kidnapped from other nations. 2. Foreign slaves can be treated as just property, meaning that they don't have any rights, the owner can abuse them, and the owner can do with them as they please. So in other words, foreign slaves are essentially things instead of people. 3. That foreign slaves were forced into becoming slaves for life against their will. And 4. That the Bible only condones slavery when it comes to foreigners. Now what's interesting is that I understand the passage in almost the exact opposite way. I don't think that the passage supports any of those points. So here's how I understand what's going on in the passage. So when we look at the Hebrew, the people that are mentioned in this passage are called the Toshab, the sojourners, and also the Gar, the foreigners. The Gar and the Toshab are people who come from another land who wanted to find refuge in Israel for one reason or another. Presumably for political reasons, economic reasons, religious reasons, such as they embraced Yahweh, or perhaps they ran away from or were exiled from their nation. So I understand that people in this passage sold themselves into slavery and were not kidnapped against their will. Nor was it commanded for them to stay for life. Instead, it was a permission. So how did Cosmic Skeptic and I come to such radically different perspectives on this passage by reading the same verses? Am I just reading this passage with rose-colored glasses because I'm too scared to see what the Bible actually says? Or is Cosmic Skeptic isolating this verse and reading his modern understanding of slavery into the passage? Now from the outside, just reading this verse by itself, it does look like I'm on the outs on this one. But before we jump to conclusions, let's unpack this just a bit further.
So what else can we take from this excerpt? Well, take note of the language used to describe the slaves. Quote, they will become your property. Even if someone is treated well, there's no excuse for considering a human being as property.
So the obvious question here is, what is meant by property? As we saw in the last video, the word used for slave, abad or abed, is a morally neutral word and is not intrinsically negative. Property seems to be similar. On Cosmic Skeptic's understanding of the word property in this passage, the word is clearly derogatory. He seems to think that the word property here implies that a person doesn't have any rights, the owner can do with them as they please, the owner can hold them against their will, and the owner can abuse them. But as we just saw, the passage is about the toshab and the gar, the sojourner and the foreigner. His translation says temporary residents among you. The other translations say sojourner or foreigner, which is a lot easier. So going forward, to make it easier for all of us, I'm just going to say foreigner. So if we back up just a few chapters in Leviticus, we see another place where God is talking about the same people, the toshab who's living as the gar. The passage says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. You shall love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord, your God. Interesting. So just a few passages before the passage that Cosmic Skeptic cited, we read that the Israelites were commanded to not mistreat them, to love them as they love themselves, and also to remember that they too were foreigners. Interesting. Interesting indeed. But maybe it was a fluke, who knows? Maybe it was some sort of special context. So let's just go to another book. How about Exodus? In Exodus, we read again, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves knows how it feels to be foreigners because you were foreigners in Egypt. Also in Exodus, do not mistreat or oppress a foreigner, for you were foreigners in Egypt. What about Deuteronomy? Cursed is anyone who withholds justice from the foreigner, the fatherless, or the widow. Or how about in Deuteronomy 10:19, where we read, for the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. And there's plenty of verses like this. So now, where are the verses that say that you can treat these foreigners like a piece of furniture? To make matters more confusing, Cosmic Skeptic ends his reading at verse 46, but when we pick up at verse 47, we read how not only could these servants become rich, but they could also own other servants. So let me get this straight. The foreigners were not to be oppressed, were not to be mistreated. The Israelites were cursed if they withheld justice from the foreigners. The foreigners had the potential to become rich. They could also have slaves themselves. And the Israelites were commanded to love them. And not just love them as much as they love themselves. So if we read this verse in isolation, and we also had the concept of slavery in our minds that we learned in school growing up, then it would seem to prove his point. But if we read more than just this verse, then it becomes clear that the word property couldn't possibly mean what Cosmic Skeptic believes it to mean. So what about my understanding? How do I understand the word property? My understanding of the word property here in Hebrew, ahuzah, is not in reference to a person's value, but instead it's in reference to the value of their labor output. This is made even clearer when we continue reading where Cosmic Skeptic left off and read verses 49 through 53. Here it's clear that the redemption price is not based on the person as an object, but instead it's based on the value of their labor output. But let's just say that I'm wrong. And let's just say that the Hebrew word here is in reference to the person rather than the work that they do. Even if that were the case, we do know one thing for certain. We know for certain that the word couldn't possibly mean what Cosmic Skeptic believes it to mean, given the dozen of verses that describe the foreigners of having rights, commanded to be loved and taken care of, and also not being treated like a beat-up couch. So once we understand what the word can't mean, it helps us to be able to understand what the word does mean. And this changes how we understand the language of buying and selling. This could be similar to what's meant today when we talk about buying and selling and trading sport players. When we talk about sport players being bought and sold, we don't mean that they don't have value. Instead, what we're referring to is the work that they perform. So the only point I want to make from this analogy about the sports players is that you can use that language without saying that the person has no value. All you have to do is look at the context in which the language is being used.
And as the 46th verse here says, the slaves mentioned in this part of the Bible can be inherited by the children of the original owner, and you can, quote, make them slaves for life. If God is giving the Israelites authority to indefinitely enslave people of other nations and make them slaves for life, these people were not simply workers or in some kind of voluntary dependent relationship agreement. They're not free to leave. This is outrageous, regardless of how they're being treated.
So as I said earlier, Cosmic Skeptic has taken this verse to mean that God is commanding the Hebrews not to release foreigners. And my view is that God was giving them permission to keep the foreigners rather than instructing them to keep the foreigners. So how did I come to that conclusion? Well, I just took into consideration the context of what's being talked about. So here's what's going on here. This chapter is talking about the year of Jubilee. The verse is right before the passage that Cosmic Skeptic quotes. In the passages, God is talking about the Hebrew servants working until the year of Jubilee and then being released back to their own land. And that the year of Jubilee, all debts are to be wiped free. It's like hitting the reset button on the economy. All debts are canceled and everybody goes home. So then the question arises, how does this work for the foreigner when they don't have any land to go back to? Well, if most or all of them couldn't go back home for whatever reason, then it seems that God's given them the permission to stay permanently if they wish. Notice the language here. Is God commanding them to stay for life? In the passage, God is saying you can or you may. He's not saying that you must or you shall. This seems to be given permission. It's not like earlier when we read in Leviticus where God commanded the Israelites by saying, you shall love them as you love yourselves. In my survey of the words Toshav and Gar, there's only a few times when there were exceptions for the foreigners, and in those times it was directly related to the land. So it had nothing to do with race, it was about the land. So if the foreigners wanted to come stay, they could, and this isn't as grim as Cosmic Skeptic tries to make it out to be, especially given the fact that the Israelites were commanded to love them, treat them good, not oppress them, and so on. But again, I always like to consider the fact that I could be wrong here. So let's say that I am wrong here, and they weren't allowed to go, and they had to stay for life. Still, we have no indication in the text at all that they were kidnapped or forced to come to Israel against their will. By the way, where does it say in this verse that you can kidnap these slaves from other nations? Take a look. I don't see it. Do you? In fact, there's other verses that give the death penalty for stealing people. The only way that this can even seem like a possibility is if we have the modern idea of slavery in our minds when we're reading this passage. So if I was wrong and that was the case, then it seems that the foreigners are being offered, you can come to Israel, but you have to stay permanently. Not to mention, in Deuteronomy we read, you shall not give up to a master a slave who has escaped from his master to you. He shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. The other translations say that you shall not oppress him or you shall not mistreat him. So here we read that the Israelites were commanded to take in runaway slaves, not to return them to their masters, that the slave could stay wherever he would like, and that you're not to do them wrong. So perhaps you might be thinking, well then this must be referring to the Hebrew slaves. I disagree. But even if so, then this would fly directly in the face of the other verse that he quotes that we'll be discussing here in a little bit.
But hold on, how then do we explain the verse this guy mentions in his video that suggests that slaves can choose whether or not to leave? Let's look again. But if the servant declares, I love my master and do not want to go free, then he will be his servant for life. I just argued that slaves have no choice in whether to be slaves or not, but this quote from Exodus 21 seems to clearly state that slaves can choose whether to be slaves for life or not. So how do we square this? Well, like I say, this guy quoted Exodus 21 verses 5 to 6, but let's back up a little bit and read from verse 2. We get the following. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years. But in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything, and so on and so forth, up to the quote this guy used that the slave himself can decide whether or not to be a slave for life. This is the element of truth I was referring to, but pay close attention. These verses are referring specifically to Hebrew servants, not slaves taken from other nations. It's the slaves taken from other nations who are the ones mentioned in Leviticus. So the guy in the video is quoting verses that relate to the, at least partially, voluntary service of Hebrew individuals, not verses relating to the regulation of slaves taken from foreign nations. These, the foreign slaves, are the ones who we should be concerned about. He's quoting regulations about the wrong people. This is a prime example of the Bible being taken out of context. And I don't just mean the context of the time it was written or something like that, but the context of the very sentences within it.
First off, Parr is talking about slavery overall, as almost every skeptic I've ever heard talk about slavery does. From what I've seen, the skeptics always quote two verses, Leviticus and Exodus 21. For Cosmic Skeptic to make it appear as though Parr had Cosmic Skeptic's distinctions of the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew Israelite in mind goes back to what we talked about in the last video. Cosmic Skeptic is still assuming that Parr is in some sort of imaginary debate with them.
But even if we ignore this and only talk about the Hebrew servants mentioned in Exodus 21, we've still got problems. How were these servants treated? Well, let's take a look at one of these regulations, shall we? Exodus chapter 21, verses 20 to 21. And this verse comes just after the one the guy quoted in the video regarding Hebrew servants. Anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Okay, so it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine. In what world should we consider this acceptable moral guidance? You, Mr. Videomaker, were the one who brought up the regulations on slavery, and you were the one who quoted Exodus 21 to defend your position. All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime.
Oh man, where do we start? First, where does it say that this is in reference to Hebrew slaves? Passage says nothing about this only referring to Hebrew slaves. From what I understand, the laws are for everyone, and if there is going to be a difference between the Hebrew and the non-Hebrew, then the passage will specify. Otherwise, it's referring to the laws of Israel, and everybody living in Israel is under that law. But second, he is once again factually wrong. Does this verse say,
it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine.
Is that what this verse is really saying? Or is he once again reading this verse out of context and inserting his modern understanding of slavery into the context? But surely, he can't be reading this verse out of context, could he? Immediately before this passage, and I mean literally just sentences before he quoted the passage, he complained about people not reading the very sentences in the passage.
This is a prime example of the Bible being taken out of context. And I don't just mean the context of the time it was written or something like that, but the context of the very sentences within it.
He then goes in on Parr, shunning him for being so terrible as to not read the following passages in order to get the right context.
All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime.
But what happens when we read the verses immediately after the ones that Cosmic Skeptic just read? Well, let's see. An owner who hits a male or female slave in the eye and destroys it must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. And an owner who knocks out the tooth of a male or female slave must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. So what we've learned here is that a slave can go free if he's abused. So it's just wrong to say that he can be beat mercilessly and be forced to stay. The very thing that he condemned Parr for is literally the exact same thing that he himself is guilty of. You just can't make this kind of stuff up. If he actually took his own advice and just read the next few verses, then he would understand that what he took from the verse 20 and 21, and I quote,
it's perfectly permissible to mercilessly beat your slaves with a rod as much as you want, and this should only be punishable if the slave dies as a, quote, direct result. If they get up after a few days, everything's fine.
Then he would have realized how wrong he was. The passage couldn't possibly mean that you could beat a slave within an inch of their life, and as long as the slave doesn't die, then you get away scot-free. So now we have an explicit statement just a couple verses later that says that there is punishment if you abuse your slaves. Now, as funny as this is, we're still left with the question of what's actually meant by verses 20 and 21. Let's read them again. Anyone who beats their male or female slave with a rod must be punished if the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. The word being used here for punish is nakam, which is specifically talking about the death penalty as it does every other time in the Old Testament. So all this passage is saying is that if you kill a slave, then you get the death penalty. You take a life, you lose a life. A life for a life. Uh-oh. Is he pulling a Kathy Newman on the Bible? Bible. You kill a slave, you get the death penalty. Cosmic Skeptic. So you're saying we can beat them all we like, even within an inch of life. There's nothing special about an eye or a tooth, by the way. The passage is saying that you can't abuse your slaves. So here we actually have Cosmic Skeptic reading his own context into the verse, looking down on Christians and accusing them of doing the very thing that he's doing. Yeah. But really, Cosmic Skeptics still seem to miss the commonsensical fact that if you hurt or kill your slave, you don't benefit. You lost your worker, now you have to do all of the work yourself, and you don't get paid. You don't win in that situation. Now, once again, recall what we read earlier in Deuteronomy about the runaway slave. If you remember, the Israelites were commanded to take in the runaway slave, not to return them to their master. The slave could stay wherever he would like, and you're not to oppress them, mistreat them, or do them wrong. So if this passage applies to the Hebrew slave rather than the non-Hebrew slave, then this flies directly in the face of the argument that you can beat your Hebrew slave as much as you like and they have to take it as long as they survive. But if the Hebrew slaves were commanded to just take a beating, as he seems to argue for, then why is it that the Israelites were commanded to take them in and care for them if they ran away? Why were they commanded to not return them to their harsh masters and not oppress them, mistreat them, or do them wrong? Looks like they had a way out if they wanted. They could literally go wherever they wanted to go. So at this point, you might be saying, well, then this verse must not apply to the Hebrew slave. But if it doesn't apply to the Hebrew slave, then it would apply to the non-Hebrew slave, the one that we talked about in Leviticus 25:44-46. But if this is the case, it still seems to be at odds with the Leviticus passage as he understood it. He understood the passage to be a command that the foreigners could be treated like a dumpster and forced not to leave. But again, if this is true, then why were the Israelites commanded to take care of them, not to return them to their masters, let them live wherever they would like, and not to do them wrong, mistreat them, or oppress them? If they truly were forced to stay for life, then you would think that they would be punished for running away. But even at that, they're commanded not to oppress them or mistreat them. And that flies directly in the face of the view that the foreign slaves could be oppressed and treated poorly. Once again, this seems to clearly argue against his understanding of the passages, and it seems to fit nice and smoothly with my understanding of the passages. But one more time, let's just consider the fact that I could be wrong once again, and he's correct on his understanding of both passages. So in his understanding, the Exodus passage says that you can beat your Hebrew slaves as much as you like as long as they don't die. And he understands the Leviticus passage to say that you can treat the non-Hebrew slave much, much worse. Think about that. Do you see the issue here? If you can beat a Hebrew slave as much as you want, as long as they don't die, and you can treat the non-Hebrew slave far worse than you can treat the Hebrew, then that would mean that you could kill the non-Hebrew slave, because that's the only thing that's worse than beating them within an inch of their life. But of course this isn't true, especially given all the passages that we read earlier about how you're supposed to love them and care for them and don't do them wrong, and to treat the non-Hebrews the way that you treat the Hebrews. So either way, even if we accepted his apparent misunderstanding of these passages, they still wouldn't be coherent argued in the way that he argues for them. And this is also consistent with the commonsensical fact that you do not hurt or kill your slave. If you hurt your slave, they can run away and they can go stay with someone else, and the Israelites are commanded to take them in and also not to do them wrong.
If they get up after a few days, everything's fine. In what world should we consider this acceptable moral guidance?
That's a good question. May I be so brave as to say a world where there's no moral absolutes, where all morals are subjective, where morals are illusory, and where they're just opinions? I'm talking about the world that Cosmic Skeptic himself believes that we live in.
Imagine if your boss could beat you as much as he wanted as long as you didn't die. It's ridiculous.
That is ridiculous. Keep slugging at that straw man, buddy. You're getting them pretty good.
All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there.
The lie detector test determined that was a lie.
Now, if you think about it, if the Bible does condemn kidnapping people, treating them like property, abusing them, and so on, then it seems the Bible does flat out condemn the things that Cosmic Skeptic finds so repulsive about the slavery that he reads about in the Bible after all.
You, Mr. Video Maker, were the one who brought up the regulations on slavery, and you were the one who quoted Exodus 21 to defend your position. All I'm doing is actually looking up the things that you're referencing in the Bible and actually reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime.
You, Mr. Skeptic, are reading Exodus 21 to support your position. All I'm doing is reading them in context and reading what's there. Maybe you should try it sometime. So that does it for part 2. The next part is our final part of the series, in which we're going to be talking about the sex slaves and the racism that Cosmic Skeptic believes is approved in the Bible. So it should be a good one. Hope to see you guys there. So if you're not already in the playlist, go ahead and click right here, and I'll see you guys over at that next one. And what do you mean? Welcome back to my channel and the final part of our review of Cosmic Skeptic's video on the Bible and slavery. Now, if I had to pick, I'd say that this one is my favorite video in the entire series. In this video, we're going to be talking about the so-called sex slaves, the prisoners of war, the alleged racism in the Bible, understanding the Old Testament, and more. And as I said in the last 2 videos of this series, and I did not lie, this video also will only get better and better as it goes on. So make sure you stick around because it's going to be dope. You guys ready? Let's get into it. So if you recall in part 1 of this series, I made 3 distinctions when we're talking about slavery in the Bible. So the first category were the Hebrew slaves, and they're better understood as indentured servants. It seems that Cosmic Skeptic agrees with me that the Hebrew slaves were hired servants. The second category are the foreign slaves or servants. In the last video, I argued why I don't agree with Cosmic Skeptic that the foreign slaves were somehow treated much worse than the Hebrew slaves. I argued that slavery for them was volitional as well. And the third and the last category is what I temporarily called the bad guys. This category includes prisoners of war and captured armies. The bad guys were obviously a threat to not only Israel, but also its moral structure. But more on that later. In the last 2 videos, we talked a lot about the first and the second category, but in this video, we're going to be talking more about the third category. So let's just get a little bit of context out the way before we get going. The couple of passages that Cosmic Skeptic quotes in support of his position come from the earlier books in the Bible, such as Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. So far in this series, I haven't really given an explanation as to why we don't see Christians today doing the weird stuff that we read in Leviticus, Exodus, and Deuteronomy. Are Christians today just arbitrarily picking which verses in the Bible they want to accept and live by and which ones they don't and want to reject? I've actually heard a decent amount of non-Christians say that that's exactly what Christians are doing. People who aren't familiar with the gist of the entire Bible might not understand why Christians do things like cut the corners of their hair or clip the ends of their beard when the Bible says not to do these things in Leviticus. Sometimes I forget that a lot of non-Christians see the entire Bible as one giant behavior manual. They think that the entire Bible is only one kind of narrative and it's just one big rule book. What they don't realize is that the Bible actually contains several different genres of writing. Some are intended to be historical and others are not. For example, we see books of poetry like we read in Psalms, or we have wisdom literature like we read in Proverbs. Also, when it comes to the historical stuff, some of it's descriptive, meaning that it's describing what happened rather than prescriptive, meaning it's telling you how to live your life. So now when it comes to the events being described in all of the passages that Cosmic Skeptic quoted, this is the time when God had rescued his followers from the Exodus and has delivered them to Israel. Basically, God is working to establish Israel as a nation through which the world would be blessed through Christ. Now, because this is a theocracy, God had Moses institute law code, but these laws are not how we think of laws today. Even that's a little bit misleading because there actually isn't a modern parallel to how these codes were practiced, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the surrounding nations in the ancient Near East. So keep in mind when you think of the law code, it's not the same thing that we think of today when we consider law codes. So during this time, the Bible contains different codes that are for different purposes. A lot of the laws were ancient ritual symbols to set Israel apart, as God was working to separate Israel from the surrounding nations of the time. This is why you'll read a lot of the things that sound really weird to us today, like not cutting the corners of your hair or trimming the edges of your beard, or even the famous tattoo verse. The pagans around them would cut their hair or cut marks in their skin in honor of pagan worship. So that's why it was important for the Hebrews to not engage in these things. Other laws were set to keep them away from things that in their culture symbolized death and disease and moral corruption. There were other laws that looked a lot more like case laws, the if-then laws. Laws that weren't just about being good, but were also about justice. And by the way, these laws weren't designed to cover literally every wrong thing that you can think of. Penal codes don't attempt to outlaw all moral wrongdoings. That wasn't the point of them, nor does not mentioning something mean that it's actually approved, condoned, or supported. So the point here is that a superficial reading of just some isolated laws just won't do. You have to do more than just read an isolated verse here and there to actually understand what's going on. Overall, the story of the Bible is about how God delivered his people and how he worked his plan of redemption for all people who want to enter into a covenantal and saving relationship with them. And this was done through Israel and eventually through Christ. So aside from the moral law, which is issued for all people everywhere at all times, these laws were issued specifically for these specific people at this specific time in history. So today we are under the Sinai covenant, and the Bible makes it clear that that covenant was not intended to last forever. So that's why Christians do some of the things today that the Hebrews were commanded not to do. I hope this at least gets you started on understanding why these claims about the Bible supporting slavery are wildly exaggerated. Now we can pick up where we left off last time. Are you guys ready? Let's go!
The regulations of slavery in the Bible are exactly what you'd expect from a book that refers to these slaves as property. They're awful, indefensible, superstitious idiocy that deserve the same historical condemnation as the legalities surrounding the slave trade in the USA.
Alright, so we already talked about the property thing in the last video, but I think this gives us a good time to highlight exactly why slavery was needed in this culture. What people don't realize is that there weren't a million jobs for people like there is today. If you were a farmer and you had crops that got destroyed or didn't produce, then how are you supposed to survive? Say you owe people a lot of products, then how are you supposed to pay your debt and provide for your family? Essentially, the only option would be for you to go live with someone else, have them provide food and clothing for your family and yourself, yourself while also working to pay off your debt at the same time. So slavery was needed in this society in order for it to continue on, and that's why it makes a lot more sense to me for God to regulate slavery rather than abolishing it. It's kind of like why some people today might choose to go to the army. In the army, people will voluntarily forfeit certain rights and certain freedoms. They actually voluntarily become the legal property of the US Army, and they're forfeiting certain rights and certain freedoms, and they're trading that for security.
And this is still only in reference to Hebrew slaves. Elsewhere in the Bible, we see what's condoned when enslaving people from foreign nations, such as the Midianites. In Numbers chapter 31, verses 17 to 18, Moses instructs the following: "Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, what use could these men possibly have for keeping all the virgin girls, quote, for themselves? I wonder.
Sexual slavery. Now, I can't be sure, but I'd say that there's a pretty high probability that Cosmic Skeptic's research on this topic has come down to a simple Google search or just printing the arguments of other online atheists, in which case I wouldn't recommend getting your biblical criticisms from him. Now, I've noticed somewhat of a pattern in these verses that he's using. It seems that because there's this presupposition that the Bible supports slavery in the same way that we understand the word today, that the texts are being read with that in mind instead of it being read out of the text. It's kind of like when you decide not to trust someone, you start reading in bad intentions into the things they do when there are no bad intentions there. So with that in mind, where does it say to take these women, have sex with them, and rape them? It doesn't. He's once again assumed the meaning into the text without bothering to read the chapters coming before it. This is why he read God saying, hey, feel free to use these women as sex toys since they're virgins. Kidnap them, use them for sex, and dispose of them as you wish. Now, this is wrong on a lot of levels. So let's talk about what's going on in the chapters before this verse and why God commanded for them to keep the virgins alive. So the basic context here is that the Midianites teamed up with Balaam and they came up with a plan to lead the Israelites into pagan worship and for the women to lead the Israelites into pagan worship through ritual sex. At Peor, the Midianite women deliberately seduced the Israelite men into orgies and worshiping Baal. The women also cursed God's people, and this is why we read in the verse immediately before the one that Cosmic Skeptic quotes, we read Moses saying, "Have you allowed the women to live?" he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that a plague struck the Lord's people. So the context here is that this had to do with infiltrating Israel with pagan worship through ritual sex and violating the purity laws. So this is why it was okay to keep the virgins alive, but not the other people who engaged in the ritual sex and pagan worship. And this was made even more clear when we read earlier how the Hebrews that engaged in the sexual acts with the women were also put to death. So this is clearly about behavior. The virgins were the ones who didn't engage in the ritual sex and didn't try to seduce the men into it. So that's the reason why the virgins are singled out in this verse. And we already know from not only Deuteronomy 21, but also the purity laws that were given to the Israel soldiers that rape was obviously not an option. So the soldiers couldn't just go and rape these women, nor were they able to use these women as just sex slaves. In fact, the Israelite men were told that they could marry these women, not as slaves, but as wives. And an Israelite man would have to go through a series of procedures before he could even make her his wife. So this was obviously not some sort of kidnap these women and use them as sex objects type of thing. Now, just as kind of a side note, it's also worth noting that after the men were killed in battle, these women had nowhere else to go. The society wasn't like it is today where a woman can just go get a job and she'll be fine. The men had to hunt and go get the food for the women to even survive. So the women in this culture needed men. This is why God over and over and over in the Bible commands the Israelites to take care of the widows and take care of the fatherless. I mean, it keeps coming up over and over. God commands the Israelites to take care of the widow, the fatherless, and the foreigner. So these women were actually added to the families of the Israelites, and the Israelites were commanded to treat them as such and to love them as wives. So for Cosmic Skeptic to say that these women were sex slaves shows that he's not familiar with the context, nor is he familiar with any of the literature written on this verse.
Why aren't we seeing a defense of verses like this, condoning not just slavery, but sexual slavery? I'll tell you why. Because they're indefensible. So good luck to anybody who tries it.
I literally just gave a defense of a verse like that. So they aren't indefensible.
Which leads me to my fourth point, which is that kidnapping, according to Exodus chapter 21, in any and all circumstances was completely and totally outlawed and punishable by death. And so this idea that you could take somebody against their will and make them your slave was not only against the law, but it was outside of the will of God.
Okay, this all depends on translation. This guy seems to be using the New International Version of the Bible. But for instance, the King James Bible...
Wait, hold up, pause right there. So let me get this straight. So now this verse, the one that obviously goes against his view, all of a sudden depends entirely on translation. And now he's quoting the King James Version? Now, I hope he realizes what would happen if he were consistent here. If he quoted the King James Version for the entire video, then he would realize that the word slave only appears once in the Old Testament and once in the New Testament, and not in any of the verses that he quoted. Funny, right? All right, back to it.
But for instance, the King James Bible, in the verse just quoted, doesn't say that you can't kidnap people, it says that you can't stealeth them. I'd wager that it makes little sense to outline all of the regulations on slavery that we've just talked about in the Bible, and then say here that you can't take slaves. Because of this, it seems that this verse is saying that you can't steal a man who is either rightfully free or who belongs to somebody else already. Why else would there be so many laws around slavery if there really was just this simple condemnation of it elsewhere in the Bible?
So now this seems odd to me for a couple reasons. First, why does it make little sense to regulate slavery and then say you can't kidnap slaves? I don't see what I'm missing. Is he saying that slavery is only slavery if the people are kidnapped? If I'm mistaken here, please help me understand in the comments down below. But if this is what he means, then his entire argument has to rest on the fact that these slaves were kidnapped. And if so, then that's really bad news for him. Second, notice how the verse gives the death penalty for not only anyone who kidnaps a man, but also for anyone who's caught with a man that's kidnapped. So you can't be like, yo, it was him. I mean, you would get the death penalty in both cases. This is a super strict restriction on kidnapping people. Also, we read Paul citing the law in 1 Timothy 9-10. In it, he says how it's wrong to kidnap a man. Not to mention, I haven't seen a single shred of evidence or a single verse imply that it's okay for you to go kidnap a man. In the Leviticus passage that he quotes, it specifically says in that passage, buy or sell. It doesn't say go out and kidnap. The closest thing we see to that are prisoners of war, but prisoners of war are a whole new category. It's not like these are innocent people who are just kidnapped. Okay, so consider this. Say that you're in battle at a time like it was in ancient Israel, and those who you're at war with will kill you and your family and everyone you love any chance they get because they will show you no mercy. So say you win. Now, what do you do with those that are still alive? You have three options that I can think of. One, you kill the rest of the soldiers, which seems like the obvious choice in this sort of situation. This is the clear choice for most of the armies at the time. Or two, you can let them go free, but if you let them go free, they can seek revenge and plot to kill you and your family while you're asleep. So leaving them alive is an obvious risk. Or three, you can allow them to live and to come work for you. In the third option, you're actually extending them mercy by letting them live. But again, you can't just let them roam free. So allowing people from a captured army to come live among you means that obviously they're going to be a bigger threat. The captured army members could potentially start an uprising. So the prisoners of war are obviously going to have more restrictions. They're going to be working a lot harder and they're going to be under closer supervision. But even with this, Israel was still commanded to love those prisoners of war. When a group of people come from another country and come to America and try to kill the American people, we're either going to kill them or put them in prison. And this would be even worse if they tried to overthrow or take over America. There's nothing unethical about killing those people or putting them in prison. In fact, it would actually be unethical for you to allow those people to roam free and allow them to continue being a threat to the American people. So instead, if they weren't killed and they were put in a prison where they had to do brutal work and work really hard, I wouldn't call that slavery. I would call them prisoners. All right, let's continue.
Also, we're dealing with an ambiguity here surrounding whether this verse applies to all people or just to Hebrews, since this is preceded by a verse that specifies that it's talking about Hebrews. We've already seen how easily God can condone kidnapping people from other nations, especially conquered nations, and not just for employment, but for something as trivial as carnal desire.
And we've already seen why he's wrong on this. Next, he just says stuff that we've already covered in previous videos. So if you don't believe me, the link is in the description and go to around the 17-minute mark. If there's anything he said there that you think I can't answer or that I haven't answered, then go ahead and just leave it down in the comments.
Number 6, slave owners were to treat slaves with respect. The Bible says in Leviticus chapter 25 that slave owners were commanded to treat slaves as employees or hired workers in terms of the type of work that they gave them.
Okay, time to see how you're doing. Let's have some viewer interaction. It's your turn. Can you guess what we'll find if we look at the verse that comes just before the one that this guy just quoted? I'll give you a second. Ding, ding, ding. Well done. We're talking specifically about Israelites. Oh, wait, no, sorry. The Bible doesn't specify that it's talking about Israelites in the preceding verse. because it does so in the exact verse being quoted. This makes me really believe that we're dealing with purposeful obscurantism here.
Can you believe this guy? So Cosmic Skeptic is trying to make Parr look dishonest, but what he doesn't realize is that Parr doesn't have the same distinctions in mind that he does with the whole foreign slave and non-foreign slave thing. This is because in the Bible, there's rarely distinctions made between the Hebrew slave and the non-Hebrew slave. And as mentioned in the last video, the only time that I see these distinctions made is when it comes to land. This whole concept about there being this gigantic distinction between the Hebrew slave and the non-Hebrew slave is so ridiculously exaggerated and blown out of proportion that it's not even funny. This is why people who hold this view almost always quote Leviticus 25:44-46. This is the only verse that I can think of that on the face of it seems like there's this big distinction between the Hebrew slaves and the non-Hebrew slaves. But what's so ridiculous about this is it's that hard to find this elsewhere in the Bible, and they've created an entire doctrine out of this one passage. But even worse, as we also discussed in the last video, Cosmic Skeptic seems to wrongfully assume that foreign slaves were treated significantly worse than non-foreign slaves.
Not only this, but if a slave owner was guilty of killing a slave, he would be facing severe punishment himself.
So he just put up on the screen the verse we were talking about earlier about punishing slave owners who beat their slaves to death. But surprisingly, he fails to highlight that there's no punishment if the slave manages to get up after the beating. I wonder why this might be.
It's because Cosmic Skeptic is factually wrong here and Parr is factually right. It's because Cosmic Skeptic has failed to read the following passages which explicitly state that there is punishment if you hurt your slave. We also discussed this in detail in the last video. In my view, the fact that he's wrong and Parr is factually right and he's ignorant about this fact is just
quite embarrassingly ridiculous.
Hey, I couldn't have said it better. Thanks.
Slavery was never based on race. And so nowhere in the Bible does it condone enslaving a race of people, rather only individuals, and that on a voluntary basis.
Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you. From them you may buy slaves. I mean, it's literally written in black and white.
Wait, what is literally written in black and white? Where does it say, go enslave a certain race of people because of their race? Oh, and remind me again where it says you can go and kidnap slaves. So let's see that again, and let's think about Parr's point when it comes to race.
Your male and female slaves are to come from the nations around you.
Did you catch that? Did that nullify Parr's point that it wasn't based on race? The nations around you, meaning any nation around you. This isn't based on race or racism. It's not targeting people based off of their race. I mean, read it again. Does this say that you can go kidnap people because of their race? No, not even a little bit. If it's referring to anyone and everyone in any other nation, then it literally can't be about race. At best, it could be tribalistic. This is obviously not targeting people because of their race or their skin color. This is once again him taking a modern conception of slavery and reading that into the scripture rather than reading that out of the scripture. To compare what's going on in this passage and to say that it's the same as what happened with the American slave trade is misleading, false, and I'd say morally wrong. In the American slave trade, blacks were targeted because of their skin color and they were seen as subhuman. That's obviously not what's going on here. So saying that this passage is inherently racist is just really stupid, to put it nicely. A more understandable claim would be for him to say that the Bible is tribalistic, which he said earlier in the video. So let's evaluate that claim. What does the Bible have to say about how to treat people from other nations? In Numbers, the book that he quoted from to show that the Bible is tribalistic, we read, "The community is to have the same rules for you and for the foreigner residing among you. This is a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. You and the foreigner shall be the same before the Lord. The same law and regulations will apply both to you and the foreigner residing among you." In Leviticus, another book that he quotes from to try to show that the Bible is tribalistic, we also read, "When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord, your God." Also in Leviticus, you are to have the same law for the foreigner and the native born. How about Deuteronomy? "For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt." Yeah, sounds pretty tribalistic, that's for sure. And there's plenty of passages like this, so let's keep it moving.
And this verse is followed by the command not to do the same with the Israelites, again highlighting that the slaves we should be concerned about are not the ones that this guy keeps trying to use to defend his position. A verse that says, take slaves from other nations, but not from yours, is inherently racist. There's no way around it.
It's literally not.
But let's be more explicit. I referenced this earlier, this chapter, but go ahead and read chapter 31 from the book of Numbers. In the New International Version of the Bible, this has a subheading that reads, Vengeance on the Midianites, and tells of how God instructed Moses to slaughter the Midianites and to take their women as sex slaves. This was a conquest based entirely on race.
Oh, this is just getting painful at this point. First, and as we just saw, the virgins were not to be kept as sex slaves. Second, this is painfully sloppy for him to argue that this is about race. It literally was not based on race. How do I know? All you have to do is think about it. The Midianites were trying to convert Israel to pagan worship and putting curses on the Israelites. The problem was behavior, not race. But if you're stubborn and you need an additional nail in the coffin, all you have to do is read the chapters before that verse. In those chapters, you read how the Hebrews who engaged in those practices and in the ritual sex were put to death as well. Therefore, it couldn't be based on race if the Hebrews were put to death if they did the same things. Once again, this was based off of behavior, not race.
I would have said how amazing it is that the guy in this video I'm responding to didn't seem to notice the racial basis to slavery in the Bible in stories such as that of the Midianites.
Well, frankly, to be 100% honest, I actually find it amazing that Cosmic Skeptic was able to find a racial basis for the slavery mentioned in those passages when it literally wasn't there.
But on second thought, it makes perfect sense since he's only choosing to read verses referring to Hebrew servants, not to racist slave-taking mentioned elsewhere.
But on second thought, it does make sense if he only reads verses taken out of context by online atheists and refuses to read the verses in context themselves. Yeah, makes perfect sense.
So in summary, my video today serves two purposes. First, I obviously hope to have shown you that slavery is in fact condoned in the Bible, and it's not some nice kind of slavery, if there can even be such a thing.
Well, you failed miserably on the first one, so how about the second?
But second, I think this serves as a demonstration of just how important it is to contextualize biblical injunctions. When someone shows you a verse that seems to be anti-slavery or something like that, just take a minute to read the sentences surrounding it. Sometimes it's as simple as that.
Amen to that one. He's right on that.
And likewise, don't go throwing around Bible verses that you think make it out to be an evil book if you're not sure of what context those verses are speaking in.
Wow. And now if he would only just take his own advice, the world would be a better place. Just about done here, so what's the final word that he leaves for us?
Be careful reading that Bible. It's a dangerous book. I've been Alex O'Connor, or Cosmic Skeptic. Thank you for watching.
What an interesting way to end the video. You know who else thought the Bible was a dangerous book to be read? That's right, the slave traders in America, which is why they tried to keep the slaves from reading it. They did everything in their power to keep the slaves illiterate and away from the Bible. The reason why is because they knew that if the slaves could read the Bible, they would no longer be able to give them these isolated spoon-fed texts. They would come to know that in Christ there is no slave nor free, that all men are equal and to be loved and to be treated fairly, and that all men are made in the image of God and are to be respected and loved by those who have authority over them. This is why Martin Luther King, who was a devout Christian, didn't say, hey, the solution to the problem is to get rid of our Bibles, get rid of Christianity, and we can all be secular. Instead, his argument was stay true to the Bible and stay true to Christianity. So yes, the Bible was certainly a dangerous book for the white slave owners, which is why Christians who were armed with the entire Bible were able to use the Bible to fight against the evils of the slavery that took place in America. So next time that you hear Cosmic Skeptic saying
Slavery is in fact condoned in the Bible,
you can say not only was that
quite embarrassingly ridiculous,
but what do you meme? The following video you're about to see was made for Cross-Examined's YouTube channel. Go ahead and check them out. I'll leave a link down below. We're told about how slave owners in America used the Bible as a tool to maintain slavery and to keep slaves in a submissive position. But is that true? Well, my answer to that question is yes and no. Now, if you're confused, then go ahead and take a look at this clip. Yo, what up guys? This is John McCrae of Whaddo You Meme for CrossExamined.org. Now, as conversations about racism have dominated social discussions recently, this has shifted more into talk about white supremacy. And as white supremacy has become more of a topic, the Bible has been coming up more and more in these political discussions and conversations. Now, the reason for this is primarily because we're told about how slave owners in America used the Bible as a tool to maintain slavery and to keep slaves in a submissive position. But is that true? Well, my answer to that question is yes and no. Now, if you're confused, then go ahead and take a look at this clip from NBC Nightly.
Inside Washington's Museum of the Bible, a single volume that is like no other. The so-called Slave Bible, remarkable not for what's in it, but for what's not.
So about 90% of the Old Testament's been removed and about 50% of the New Testament's been removed. To put it another way, a normal King James Version has 1,189 chapters in it. The Slave Bible has only 232.
Missing are chapters and verses that might have encouraged uprisings. Book of Exodus, redacted. No story of Moses demanding Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Gone is Galatians, and the verse, "There is neither bond nor free, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." And no Jeremiah, "Woe unto him that useth his neighbor's service without wages."
What they've left in are verses such as Ephesians 6:5, which is the famous verse, "Slaves, be obedient to your master."
Looking at this Bible, it's hard to tell that anything's been taken out of it.
That's correct. I mean, it looks like a normal book. For many enslaved Africans, this would have been the first time they were exposed to the Bible.
A Bible selectively edited to instill obedience, using religion to underpin the horror of slavery.
When people encounter this exhibit, what lasting impression do you want them to leave with?
But we want to pass the message on that may this never happen again. The Bible itself is a whole book. It's not one that you get to carve up and use this piece or that piece.
The Slave Bible designed to repress rebellion, but it didn't work. Enslaved people in the Caribbean constantly fought against slavery until emancipation.
I think it's very relevant to understand our history, not just American history, but our African American history, our roots and how we got to this point.
So, if you're a person that believes that the Bible supports and condones slavery, then you'll have to ask yourself, why is it that the slave owners would take out these large chunks of the Bible when they went against their cause? If it's so clear that the Bible supports and condones slavery, then why is it that they had to take out these small verses and passages out of context in order to spoon feed those verses to the slaves while keeping them ignorant on the rest of the Bible? It's almost as if they were too afraid for the slaves to read the Bible and then conclude that the Bible does not support slavery, doesn't it? Now, if you want to know more about this topic of the Bible and slavery, go ahead and check out my YouTube channel called Whaddo You Meme, where I did a series on this topic, and I talk about the most common verses that skeptics quote in order to say that the Bible supports slavery and show why I believe that they don't. And you can also find more resources on this topic at crossexamine.org. And make sure you go ahead and check out CrossExamine's YouTube channel by clicking here. And, I almost forgot. What do you mean?